This conference will now be recorded.
Which make this webinar on an economic outlook as to what we are going to experience over the next few weeks and months to come. Before I go into the formal introduction, let me just run you through a few housekeeping points that will help us make this a smooth exercise this afternoon and this morning. We are using GoToMeeting, which is set up in a way that allows for all of us to be visible. So right now I have in front of me almost 70 colleagues, most of who I personally know, who have just joined us, as well as our panel and moderation. For the moment, I would like to ask everyone but the speakers and the moderator to keep their cameras off and to also go on mute so that we don't have an echo. As I said, we use GoToMeeting, so you have your screen in front of you, and when you look at the screen, you have on the top different view options. If you, for example, click active camera or view everyone, you can see who either everyone in the screen or only the ones who are speaking. If you click on who is talking, it gives you a speaker view, and then you will see only the person who is currently speaking. So choose what is most convenient to you. For the Q&A, as well as any kind of communication, there is a chat function on the lower bottom of the screen that you can use to either ask questions to everyone, but also to communicate with individual participants on the call through that link. We will use that function later to collect questions and any kind of commentary that you may have to our panels and moderator. Finally, as this is always the case, please excuse if there are any connection issues on either end. We will see that we fix them as soon as possible. And there will be a recording of the session which will be sent to everyone after the call for those who have qualified for registration. We have a backup team, Emma and Alice, who sit in the central station and will make sure that everything is a smooth session. Let me say a warm and a big thanks in advance to the BAB team who set this up, and also our partners from Knight Frank, Aberdeen, Standard, and Barclays for making this event possible. I hope with that housekeeping we are all set up to go into the session. I think everyone agrees that COVID-19 is a crisis that is unprecedented. It is a major rupture. It has been a major rupture to many of us, arrived at speed, and it has to many of us had a huge impact on many aspects of our personal and business life. And I think that most of us are currently quite busy managing this crisis as best as we can for ourselves and our businesses. Something else that many of us do these days is guess. What is the impact of the crisis on trade and investment? Will the crisis be worse than the crisis in 2008? What are the different patterns that we see? Another question that we may have is, do we see a quick recovery or a longer one? What is the prospect for the UK and the US in particular, but also the key markets that some of our businesses are trading with? And then how does recovery even look like? And maybe finally, what is the role of government, and what difference do government measures make that we currently see on both sides of the Atlantic? There are many questions, but not many answers. So our team thought, and our partners thought, the best thing that we can do is to bring two leading economists together with an expert in the field of investment and a head of economics research, led by an economics reporter from the Telegraph, maybe to help us to find answers to some of these questions. As I already said, I'm seeing the participants list go up. We have almost 70 colleagues from over 50 businesses signed up, including several country heads, economists themselves, head of teams, as well as business sections. I see researchers, policy leads, and a number of other consultants on the call. And I think that shows us, as the organizers and as the panel, there's indeed a real need to properly inform the difficult decisions that many of us have to make on an everyday basis. As I hand over to Lizzy Burton, who is an economics reporter at the Telegraph, let me conclude with two things. First of all, feel free to use the chat function, as I mentioned, to participate in the call. I will monitor these questions during and after the panel presentations so that we can bring you in. This format allows for us to actually then ask you to ask the question directly to the panel, if this is something that you wish for. If this is the case, you can put your camera on and you could definitely unmute yourself, and then you will be invited to ask your question directly. I will do my best to help navigate that. And secondly, we as British American business, we are a great community and we are there for you in good times, but we are even more so there for you in challenging times. So let me say a big thanks to the many colleagues from our network who have joined us this afternoon. Your commitment and your interest is much appreciated, and it helps us do our job and helps us fulfill our mission. Thank you very much. And with that, Lizzy, over to you.
Thanks, Emmanuel, and welcome everyone to this webinar on how the UK and US economies can survive the coronavirus crisis. It's such an extraordinary time economically. Just hours ago, we saw the first contraction in the fastest contraction in the US economy since the financial crisis. So I'm going to challenge you all to see how long we can go without saying the word unprecedented. And there's such an alphabet soup of guesses as to what shape of recovery we're going to have, whether it's a V, a U, a W, an L, or a sideways J. So to help us figure that out, we have with us today two Jameses from Aberdeen Standard Investment, James McCann, Senior Global Economist, and James Athey, Senior Investment Manager. And we also have Liam Bailey, Partner and Global Head of Research at Knight Frank, and Michael Gayton, US Economist at Barclays, who joins us from New York. Thank you all for being with us. Let's start with some opening remarks from our panel. If we could go in the order that I just introduced you in, it'd be great to hear how you think the virus will impact the economies both sides of the pond. So starting with you, James McCann, please.
Thank you very much, Lizzy. And you've slightly put me on the back foot there, because I had my first line of notes unprecedented, so I think I probably failed that test. And it's difficult to talk about this without using that word. The speed of this shock, the way that large portions of economic activity have just been turned off, the depth of the contraction that we're going to see. We saw a very difficult US Q1 GDP report, but really I think that's just a sneak peek of what's coming. I think a much deeper contraction is coming in Q2. And then finally, this is a truly global shock. It's unusual to see global activity contract to the same extent in almost a synchronized way. So I think that's what is going to set this up to be really just something that we won't have seen before in terms of our lifetime. And it's absolutely right. As we watch that contraction, I think the market is already looking forward and saying, what should we expect from the rebound, and what does the recovery look like? And again, here talking about that alphabet soup of letters, you know, we've had to get a little bit creative. The way that we're thinking about it now is not V, not U, not L, but almost a reverse J, if that makes any sense. So we think a very deep initial downturn, a slow recovery, but crucially, we don't think the economy gets back to where it was going before this crisis struck, which is another economist way of saying we think there's permanent damage done to this. We think the global economy will be permanently poorer based on this shock. You know, I think for the US and UK, I think those experiences will look relatively similar in terms of the initial shock of the magnitude, but I think the proof of the pudding, and I'm sure what we'll get to today, will be how do policymakers, both monetary and fiscal, try and mitigate the size of the initial shock, prevent second order effects, and lay the foundations for a successful exit from social distancing, a successful continued containment of this crisis, but then also the foundations for a successful recovery in economic activity. Are they able to support that upswing on the way up?
Great. And if we could go to James Athey next, please.
Sure, thanks, Lizzy, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Again, I was going to try and make a joke out of the use of the U word, and you've stolen my thunder, Lizzy, so thanks for that. But it is going to be difficult. The reason that we keep using that U word, or the reasons we keep using that U word, is because not just the magnitude of the shock that we're seeing, but because of the fact that essentially it is an intentional government policy for that to be the case. So not only have we seen a hard stop to economies across the globe at exactly the same moment, but the reason for that stop is because governments have made a choice to do so. We all know that the reasons, the health reasons why that has been the case, but that in itself leads to some very unusual analysis, shall we say. So for me, the interesting point, not wanting to go over, the good stuff that James has started with there, the interesting point for me and the context of this massive decline in GDP that we are experiencing and witnessing is almost as important, maybe even more so, than the nature of the decline that we're witnessing at the moment. And that is to say that we went into this period, if you take the market highs from February the 19th, we went into this period in a very unusual state of affairs where we had low unemployment, We had essentially late cycle dynamics, which had been emerging globally for some time now, and yet leverage in its various forms was at an all-time high. So global debt as a percentage of GDP was as high as it's ever been. Corporate debt was high. Consumer debt in various markets and economies was as high as it's ever been, again, as a percentage of GDP. We had the US economy running a 5% deficit at the end of the longest expansion in record. That's not unusual, that's unprecedented. And so from our perspective, from my perspective as a portfolio manager, the reason that we had been positioned the way that we had through last year into the beginning of this year, and why we continue to be positioned that way, and that is to say defensive, is because the economy was in a place where it was not really able to withstand a shock, even a normal shock, the kind of end of cycle shock that you would normally see where unemployment rises slightly, and in doing so it damages confidence, and that begins a negative spiral which feeds off itself. That would have been something difficult to cope with given the fragilities of economies and the financial system as a result of what had been previously a fairly unprecedented state of affairs in and around 2007, 8 and 9. And so then when you throw on top of that this huge drop in activity orchestrated by governments, and then the policy responses that we've seen since, fiscal actions the likes of which we've never seen outside of wartime, monetary actions which made QE1 and QE2 look, almost irrelevant in terms of size and scale and scope. It really does lead to a mix that makes for very difficult analysis. And in my own personal opinion, we really are playing very close to the edge with the foundations of a free market capitalist system that most countries across the world use as their basis for economic prosperity. So really interesting times, really concerning times. I'll leave it just there for opening remarks.
Great, thank you. And if we could go to Liam Bailey next, please. I think Liam might be having a bit of a problem with his microphone.
There we go.
I certainly can't hear him. There you are.
Lizzy, hi. I've no idea if my camera's working as well, so you might be able to see me or maybe not.
Unfortunately not, but we can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me loud and clear. Let me just, sorry, I've joined two different ways. I've joined on my iPhone and on my computer, so I'm going to leave. I'm hoping this won't delete me. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great, okay. Yeah, very quickly, I think on the housing markets and property markets, the key story really is, UK and US housing markets have seized up. Sales volumes are going to plummet. Our view is in the UK is that sales will be down 40% for the full year 2020. The big question is around values. Values will fall. The question is really how much in both markets. It is possible that the falls could be modest, maybe sub 5%. The reason for that is inventory levels could well remain low in both markets, which we can come on to in questions. There is a risk of a bigger correction building, and the lockdown really is the key to this, and the length of the lockdown. I think industry is trying to be creative. Agents are bringing in things like virtual viewings of valuers and appraisers, are trying to do more sort of drive-by valuations and AVM models. I think government stimulus is quite interesting and how that will impact housing markets. Our current view is it's unlikely to lead to asset price rises like it did back in 2008. If it does, it'll be probably focused on markets where you've got international capital coming in, like London, Miami, and maybe New York. Mortgage rates will stay low over the medium term and will help values. However, there is beginning to be a move towards higher rates, or a push towards slightly higher rates because of the cost of for banks hedging against risk, and also the need for lenders to make provisions for bad debts and so forth. Just on two other sectors, retail and offices, very quickly. In terms of the retail sector, massively impacted. Interestingly, the UK March retail sales results came out recently for last month. Biggest ever fall year on year, 4% decline in a single month. Grocery is up 11%, non-food sales down 20%, clothing down 35%. But even online has been hit hard. If people aren't spending, they're not spending anywhere, including online and offline. And one of the interesting findings has been the impact of online and the ability of the online retailers, particularly the grocery retailers, to actually offset falls in store. Tesco saying last week that there is a cap in terms of the amount of sales that can move on online. Final word just on offices. I mean, we're basically going through the biggest ever home working experiment we've ever had. 50% of the world's population is currently in lockdown, many of them working at home at the moment. There will be some big questions over how office space will be used in the future. I think one of the big questions will be, as the lockdown is lifted, how will people begin to reoccupy new space? Social distancing will remain in place over the next few months, probably towards the end of the year. And the question really is, we've had since the GFC a big push towards more efficient use of office space, more densely occupied offices. That will need to reverse over the next few months, and probably some remodeling of office space going back towards pre-GFC densities. So that's my summary. Thank you.
Great. And if we could finally go to Michael, please.
Hey, good morning and good afternoon. So I agree with everything that's been said, and certainly around the high degree of uncertainty and what the forecast might look like. But I would argue that we may disagree on some of the details, but there's probably very large consensus, a high degree of consensus around the big picture, which is obviously we just got the GDP number for the US this morning. We'll get it for Europe tomorrow. We're in a recession already. There'll be a sizable, I'm not going to use the word contraction in the second quarter, but most people have the reduction in output is confined to the first half of the year, and economies growing in the second half of the year. That's true, at least in the Barclays forecast for the US, the UK, Europe as a whole. Of course, China is already beginning to rebound. So there's a generally contraction first half, recovery in the second half. I agree with, I forget exactly which James made this comment, but we certainly agree that there'll be a net loss in output for the year. Our forecast for the US is output down a little more than 6% on the year. We have similar size forecasts for the UK, for example. So there's a number of reasons to think we won't make all of this up. So if it's the reverse J, there will be a net loss in output because we don't make up services activity very well. Wealth effects are likely to linger in terms of their impact on consumption. We will be slow to unwind social distancing behavior, certainly until we get progress on medical solutions to COVID, if and when those vaccines may come. And finally, and this is maybe more particular to the US than the UK or Europe, but the outlook for commodity prices and oil prices is quite weak, and we're now a very heavy energy producing country, the largest in the world, at least last quarter. So there will be residual effects on the energy sector in the US that extend well beyond the quarter. So net loss, sizable loss in output for the year that's about 1.5 times as large as we saw in 08-09. And I think there's two key points that two key assumptions or points we have to unravel as we think about the future. One is the path of the virus. What does community spread look like? Are we effective at switching from what I'll call macro mitigation measures, where we shut down cities and counties, states and countries, to more targeted testing and tracing and quarantining of affected individuals? Can we do that? I think that's the first and very difficult assumption. The second is, and I think it was James who also mentioned this, can policy prevent second round effects? And at least my interpretation of that is widespread corporate defaults, a second round surge in unemployment, and a credit crunch. And I think there's a very interesting split between what's taking place in the US and what's happening in Europe and the UK. Resources from the government are flowing directly to firms and to payrolls in Europe and the UK. In the US, a lot of those resources are going indirectly from the government through the financial sector to businesses and hopefully to payrolls. So I think it's a longer process. It's a more convoluted process. It's relying on attachment by very small business to the financial sector, which may not be there. And I wonder if the efficiency of what we're doing here in the US does not match kind of the direct support that is happening in Europe and the UK. And you're going to see it obviously in the unemployment report. it risks detachment of workers from the labor force. So I do think that there's an interesting difference between how policy is being enacted, and I do wonder if it's more efficient in Europe and therefore will keep workers on payrolls more attached to the workforce and would make it easier for countries to stay in the suspended state of animation until lockdowns open. So obviously that's an unanswered question, but 2 points: what happens with community spread? How effective is policy at forestalling second round effects? If it's ineffective, then confining output losses to the first half may be a tall order. But those would be my opening comments right now.
Great, well, thank you all. If we could take a broad view and actually look back at previous crises. Michael, to start with you, as an economist, what do you see being the key differences between this crisis and previous ones that we should note?
Well, certainly, as I think was mentioned, this is a conscious choice by governments to enact mitigation and measures to bend the curve and buy time for the healthcare system to ramp up its capacity to help deal with the virus. So it's a very different shock to begin with. We've certainly had pandemics and epidemics in the past, but they've never coincided with lockdowns of major portions of the economy and sending half of the global population to work from home. So certainly the source of this is different. The response by governments is different. We're intentionally taking short-term, what we hope is short-term economic pain for longer-term gain, and it's very unusual for politicians to make that choice. It's often short-term gain at the expense of longer-term problems. So that's the first part. The second part is from a global perspective, in 08-09 anyway, the problem was the financial sector. This time around, at least in the US, and I think it's very much the same in the UK and in most parts of Europe, certainly Barclays is very much engaged with some of the lending programs that are taking place in the UK. The financial sector is the position of strength this time around. The weakness lies potentially in the corporate sector and household balance sheets. So the innovation here from a central bank perspective is different. In 08-09, it was getting the Fed's balance sheet beyond banks to non-bank financial institutions. That was an innovation. This time around, it's going directly to households, businesses, and even municipalities. So the evolution is essentially getting away from your traditional interaction with banking institutions and getting into unusual and exigent circumstances and extending your balance sheet to different parts of the economy. So those are a few points that I would make about the differences between this episode versus previous episodes.
Great. And Liam, more specifically, I'd be interested to hear your view on how the New York and London property markets are faring through this crisis and how the impact differs from 2008.
Sorry, so I mute myself. Yes, I think there's a couple of things actually. Just picking up that last point, I think the interesting thing this time around is that the lockdown, to some extent, seems sort of measurable and understandable. Back in 2008, at the beginning of the crisis, it was much less sort of apparent the scale of what we were dealing with. This time around, we kind of know there is a government-enforced lockdown, and that gives some hope that actually, because governments are in charge of the length of that it's a little bit more understandable. My only concern is that actually, as we get into this, it seems that actually that's less clear cut. And I think what we are beginning to appreciate is that there may well be more maybe mini lockdowns or more uncertainty over the lifting of the lockdown over the next few months, and I think that adds a degree of uncertainty. I think the other thing, just in terms of differences this time round compared to 2008, I think firstly policy in the US, there's quite an interesting change here with the new CARES Act in America means that there's going to be protection for homeowners with federally backed mortgages. So you should see less stock coming to the market, less inventory building in the US, which could protect the housing market there. And as your previous speaker noted, actually, I think certainly in the UK and within Europe, because money moving in to support companies through their furloughing programs, that should reduce unemployment maybe in the medium term, or that's certainly the hope. If I can just quickly return to that question about London, say London and New York, I think both markets are in very different positions. I think the London market came into the COVID situation from a low point. We've had falling prices in the central London market since 2014 because of stamp duty changes a few years ago. The market was beginning to see quite a big uptick actually in the beginning of this year. That seems to have, that has clearly stalled for the moment. But I think the interesting thing is when the market starts in London again, we're coming off a period of 25% price falls over a 5-year period. So the market is relatively well priced to come into this. In New York, particularly the Manhattan market, values have come off, let's say 10% across the prime market in the last 2 years. Again, actually things were beginning to turn a corner at the beginning of this year. Inventory levels haven't been building recently in New York, so things were in a healthier place. I think there's just a bit of nervousness about actually just how long the lockdown is in place for and how that inventory, particularly on the new build side, plays out.
Great. And if we could turn to the fiscal responses, James McCann, figures from the US Labour Department show that about half of Americans earn more now because of the $600 boost to unemployment benefits than they were working pre-crisis. So I wanted to ask you if you think that ruins the incentives for workers and if that'll slow the recovery, and who's got the incentives right in terms of the labour market?
Yeah, I mean, this is, if we go back to the CARES Act, I think part of the response maybe feels a little bit scattergun. So we had a number of policy actions aimed at, I think, were well meaningfully aimed, but aimed at mitigating part of this shock to households. We obviously had the tax rebates, the checks through the mail. We had this beefed up unemployment insurance, and then we had the paycheck protection plan as part of the CARES Act, so lending to small businesses, and those loans can become grants if they meet certain requirements, particularly around what they do with their payrolls. I think if they had their time again, I wonder if the focus might have been more along that PPP style. And Michael was talking about this a little bit, about the need to try and keep firms and their workers connected, the risks of severing those ties, and the chance that that does longer economic damage. And so I think when they look at what they're sitting with now as a policy collection, they've got the paycheck protection plan. I think that's a little bit complicated. It's not seemingly been super effective so far. There's a chance that firms are pushing to rehire to meet a June 30th deadline so that they can qualify for those loans to become grants. But I think one of the risks is that if people can't sit at home on unemployment insurance, it certainly would sound attractive to me for a short period of time if that was a possible avenue. So that it definitely does create a mixed incentive around that. Anecdotally, there have been some reports saying that there's a desire to hire some people back, and that's providing a degree of a barrier because people are better off. So I think it speaks to this point as the US response being perhaps indirect, as Michael, I think, quite nicely put it, also a little bit scattergun, creating mixed incentives. And at the moment, sadly, the proof is a little bit in the pudding with what we've seen in terms of the shakeout of the US labour market, a famously flexible labour market. It does feel like US unemployment is going to rise quite significantly, and perhaps more than we'll see in many European economies, who perhaps provided more direct support to businesses and, through simpler measures, beefed up measures, which could get to more parts of the economy. So I do fear that while a lot of those policies were well intentioned, the collage of support for households has maybe not been quite as effective so far. We'll need to see how this latest round of funding for the Paycheck Protection Program, whether that can get firms to hire back or at least stop cutting.
Great. And James Athey, we've got the Fed's policy decision almost immediately after this. And I'm wondering what more, if anything, should it and the Bank of England be doing in terms of monetary policy? They seem to have already done so much.
Sure thing. Yeah, thanks, Lizzie. That's a topic which gets me a little hot under the collar, so I'll try and refrain from getting on my soapbox. Yeah, what more can they do? Well, I fear there's a lot more they can do. If you look at central banks elsewhere in the world, even prior to this crisis, you had the SNB, the Swiss National Bank, buying stock in Apple, which they claim is some sort of monetary policy, and obviously you have the Bank of Japan buying equity ETFs, which again they claim is some sort of monetary policy. Now, I struggle to find my page in a Begg, Fisher and Dornbush textbook that tells me that's valid monetary policy. And I do think that we have gone a little bit off the range in terms of the actions of central banks in trying to deal with, you know, every last twist and turn in terms of economies and financial markets. Now, that being said, obviously, again, to not wanting to use the U word, but what we've seen over the last couple of months is an order of magnitude bigger than anything you would expect to see in a normal cycle. And so I do think it's right and proper that central banks have acted swiftly, and to a certain extent have acted in significant size. I think the Fed at the moment is somewhere close to the limits, some might say even past the legal limits, their mandated limits in terms of some of their more recent actions. Making loans to Main Street is one thing. Buying corporate bonds and potentially even buying junk bonds in the open market and the secondary market, which under their mandate, strictly speaking, they're not permitted to do. They've used a special purpose vehicle and some monetary backing from the Treasury in order to do so. That seems to be playing fast and loose. I think at the moment, the right course of action for the Fed, and this evening's meeting, I'm hoping that's what we would see, is to just be steady as she goes. It's been such a quick move from the economy is strong and robust to rates back at the floor and the balance sheet expanding at a pace which, again, dwarfs anything we saw in response to the crisis. But I think to just keep piling on those actions in such a short space of time without really having a good feel for how financial markets are digesting those actions, how the economy is progressing, how fiscal actions are supporting the economy, you know, in support of monetary actions, sometimes in conflict with monetary actions. I think at the moment certainty is very low, and therefore it's probably a good moment for the Federal Reserve to pause. So I'd expect us to not have a lot in the way of action this evening from the Federal Reserve. I think the press conference will be interesting. As always, we will closely watch. Financial markets will pore over every word from Chair Powell to see if they can get some hint on what maybe comes next. The equity market at the moment doesn't look like it needs a further boost. It's quite incredible how quickly we found our way back towards the all-time highs at a time where economies are declining at a pace that we've never seen before. So yeah, central bank actions, I think the short term, the medium term and the long term would all give you a very different answer. If you were to look through those various lenses of what we've seen so far, I'd like central banks at the moment to, you know, take a step back, to pause, and to just, you know, allow some more data to come in, allow financial markets to settle down further, so that we can, you know, we can introduce any further actions with a bit more certainty around the situation that we're dealing with.
Great. And Michael, you talked about the need to end the lockdown and how we do that, how we make the switch to more targeted measures rather than the blanket measures. How could you expand on that? What you'd like to see, and whether it needs to be different on the different sides of the pond?
Well, I think that at least in terms of what we need to see, in the US, we're behind on testing. For most of the month of April, we were testing about 150,000 people a day. So we were running about 150,000 tests a day. The positivity rate, or the share of those tests that were turning up positive for COVID, that was stable at around 20% for much of the month. Now, I'm not an epidemiologist or an infection disease specialist, but the reports I've read suggest that you're testing enough and widespread enough and sampling across the population when your positivity rate is down around 5% or below. So obviously, if we don't accelerate our testing capacity and expand our testing capacity, if the positivity rate stays elevated and we reopen, then you're risking the need to do this again in parts of the country because there are second round outbreaks. Now, we've had a little bit of good news on this front just in the very last week of April. Testing capacity, which was stable at around 150,000, is now running at about 225,000, and the positivity rate has slipped down to about around 12 or 13%. So the trajectory is there in the sense that it's moving in the right direction. We anticipate the economy will be opening up on a larger scale in the mid-May to mid-June time period. Hospital demand is estimated to peak between mid-April and mid-May. With a bit of a lag, you would think state governors would begin to reopen the economy. Some are talking about doing so already. So I think what we need to see to convince ourselves that we don't need these, statewide or countrywide lockdown effects is we need to know we're testing at an efficient rate, that testing is widely available. So if we do return to work, at least in some form, and I know that somebody in the office tests positive for COVID, I can run and get a test and get an answer quickly to know whether I need to quarantine at home or I can come back into work. So what I think we need to see is improvement on that side of the ledger. It's moving in that direction. The so-called phase 3.5 legislation that was just passed last week, it contained another 25 billion to accelerate testing. But there seems to me like we're going to have this period of vulnerability where testing isn't quite where we want it. We probably need to be at least 500,000 tests a day. Most experts would suggest the number needs to be above 1 million, but we're not going to get there in the next 30 to 45 days. But I think we need to be pushing about 500,000 tests a day to give me comfort that we can micro mitigate and quarantine, and therefore the economy can recover without significant threat of shutting down states or shutting down cities again. So that's what I would need to see.
Great. And James McCann, I understand you're a Brit in America. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective on how the politics has differed over ending the lockdown. It seems the US is much more divided on partisan lines about restarting the economy, whereas in Britain, we seem to have finally been united after all these years of fighting over Brexit.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the things we're seeing come through very clearly is this, in some parts understandable tension, but really acute tension between those states or those localities which are pushing very aggressively to reopen and restart the economy, this being linked to ideas around freedom and liberty, and those areas of the country which are still very committed to lockdown. I'd say that the polling in aggregate is still very much in favor of taking social distancing measures, but certainly you're seeing a louder and louder amount of political noise about the need for opening up, and this seems maybe to be forming part of a strategy. At least a political strategy. One of the things we're noticing and discourages us a little bit about the testing capabilities is perhaps a little bit of blame shifting or preemptive blame shifting. So at the federal level, we're seeing a lot of responsibility being pushed onto states, which in some senses makes sense. They're better able to understand how to manage their own localities, but not with the support around testing. And that's really creating a lot of frustration. And I think the sense that you've been given politically, at least, you're being given almost a no-win situation. If you open the economy too quickly and reinfection rates start, then you're responsible for that. But equally, if you don't, then you're responsible for the economic pain. So to us, this is something that makes us a little bit more pessimistic, probably, that you're about the potential, at least, for a smooth exit. And it does raise the chance increasingly that we see a fragmented exit. And I'm sure Michael's the same. I live in Boston. Within an hour, I can be in 4 states. It's not really ideal to have this on a very localized level, because obviously as people start traveling and moving between states, then they can spread the virus. So it does make me a little more pessimistic that the testing capabilities won't be ramped up as quickly as they are needed where they are needed, and that we might see a more sort of stuttering reopening where you're getting sort of advances and then relapses a little bit more. At least that's certainly a concern based on how the political response is unfolding right now.
Lovely, thank you. Liam, looking ahead, so at the long-term implications of the crisis in both countries, there's been a lot of speculation, and you mentioned about remote working becoming more permanent after the crisis, after the lockdowns ended. Do you believe that, and will it have a significant effect on property markets?
I think there's no doubt that in the short term there will be a continuation of the home working expansion. I think it'll be some time before offices are able to accommodate workers in the same level that they've had traditionally. At the moment, if you think about examples around the world, in Singapore and Dubai, when they reopened after their lockdowns, the rules from the government have been quite clear. Office occupancy is at 50% in Singapore of the initial occupancy, and in Dubai it's 30%. In fact, Dubai has even taken that further into shopping malls and other property sectors. So there's going to be an enforced requirement for more home working. I think the question is, how do businesses respond to it in the longer term? I think we've learned that, like it or not, actually, a lot of functions we probably weren't sure could function remotely can, and actually something that lots of teams have sort of found it actually not as unpleasant as they thought it might be. And I think that you're probably going to see over the next 12 months a shift back towards the office. I just wonder whether there'll be less of a kind of enforced process. I think the relationship between home working and office working will be less binary, I think, in the future. But I don't think that this is a radical shift to the office post-COVID versus pre-COVID. But I think there will be a difference in how businesses use their office space. I think one of the opportunities, I suppose, actually is for businesses to think, or actually for office providers particularly, to think about how they can attract people back into the office, because ultimately people willing to now take up the commute will be quite a big ask after a period of not commuting. So office space and office landlords will need to make sure that actually they're offering in their absolute sort of best-in-class space. And I think we've got more time to come for businesses and for office providers to think about how they want to use their business space in the future, because it isn't going to be a rapid return to normal. So there will be many more months ahead of us where you're in a kind of hybrid between the lockdown and full opening economy.
Great. And finally, James Athey, we're here with the British American Business Council, so it seems only fitting that we talk about the trade relationship. We were promised an FTA this year, but how has coronavirus impacted the likelihood of a trade deal, do you think? And how much more will it matter now who's in the White House in January?
Sure thing, thanks, Lizzie. I'm not sure it necessarily affects the likelihood of a trade deal between the UK and the US. Obviously, the time horizon, I think it's fair to say, might be just stretched out that little bit. The interesting thing about the UK-US trade deal is that to a very large degree, it does depend on the UK's ongoing relationship with the European Union. Again, it's always been the case that the more closely aligned we are with the European Union with respect to regulations, but future regulations, the more difficult that makes an all-encompassing trade agreement with the US. That's something that a number of US politicians have been on the record as stating for quite some time now, and I think that continues to be the case. So then when you look at the timelines for agreement progress on the UK and the EU trade negotiations, it does appear that the UK is sticking to its stance of no further extension, and therefore at the moment there is a date in June after which we are technically not allowed to ask or not allowed to agree an extension, and therefore on the 31st of December 2020 we should know with what future relationship, be that absolutely no agreements whatsoever, just reverting to common external tariffs and very little facilitation, be that something closer to Australia whereby we have some facilitation agreements in place, but again no free trade in the sense that we will still be subject to tariffs between ourselves and the European Union, or something closer to the all-encompassing Canadian agreement, which obviously removes tariffs and barriers to a much greater degree. Again, how closely we are aligning ourselves in terms of changes to future regulation will then have some feedback into the UK-US trade relationship. As you've said, you can't also ignore the political calendar, and come November, we will find out who the new incumbent in the White House will be. I don't think that will have a huge impact on the likelihood of a trade relationship, because again, these are two nations who have a relationship which goes back much further than just recent times. But again, it may well have an impact on the prioritization of a free trade agreement between ourselves and the US. Certainly we saw under the previous president that he wasn't quite so keen for that to be at the top of his to-do list. We've seen under President Trump that he's much more keen. He does talk about his familial ties to the United Kingdom, and so he does seem to sort of prioritize that special relationship that we have. So definitely lots of unknowns. I think the end game is definitely continued close trading relationship between ourselves and the US, ultimately through some contractual relationship, some sort of trade agreement. But again, the time horizon for that has probably just been pushed out that little bit by the fallout from all that we're seeing in the current environment.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much. I think it's time to hand over to questions from our audience. So, Emmanuel, if you'd like to pick what we've had so far.
Thank you very much, Lizzy. And conscious of time, what I suggest to do, and I apologize to all those who wanted to speak in person right now, but I suggest for the moment we do, let me just try to summarize some of the questions and put them to you, and then you can decide who from the panelists should give it a go. We have a several set of questions that have come in over the past few minutes. First one from Michael, who is asking, development of pound and dollar over the next few weeks and months. What can we expect from an economist perspective? I have another question here from Christine, who was asking whether we see a second economic shock if the UK decided not to extend the transition, and a cliff edge scenario would be again in the talks. And then it's a little bit of a wider set of questions here. What we received, it's really more on the tangible side. We have a number of colleagues on the call who lead businesses or larger teams, and they are of course wondering and are interested in some sort of a summary. So what is it that they as business leaders need to prepare for over the next few months? And we have heard a little bit of a phase plan. We have heard of certain social distancing measures staying in place until the end of the year. I think there is still confusion among larger and smaller businesses how to prepare for that. And maybe I'll link one question and then I stop with the questions for the moment. One link question to that is the situation, particularly for smaller businesses who may in the long run not be able to afford a situation that is close to what we currently see. So I just repeat, so we have a question, a quick one on pound and dollar. We have a question on second economic shock from Brexit, and then we have a more tangible set of questions, in fact, on what would you, I mean, of course, we know it's hard to predict, but right now, given your expertise, what would you say, and what is it what you tell your clients, what would you suggest for business leaders to plan for in terms of slowly reopening the business and adjusting the business for the rest of the year? Over to you, Lizzy.
Would anyone like to come in first?
Sure. I mean, I'll do the market one because I guess I'm supposed to be the markets guy here. So sterling and the dollar. Trying to forecast sterling has been among the biggest nightmares in FX land for quite some time now, mostly because of Brexit. Sterling was possibly one of the worst affected G10 currencies when the recent kind of crisis really reached its peak. Liquidity disappeared and it was really gapping very weakly. But I have to say that on a strategic time horizon, I am a sterling bull. That's best expressed in my opinion versus the euro. Essentially, you know, at 87, roughly 0.87 euro sterling, that's still pricing something very akin to a very damaging and disruptive Brexit. I don't think that's where we're headed, but I do think that what we're seeing in terms of coronavirus and the economic and political fallout is actually probably going to be most painful for the Eurozone. We're starting to see real tension and stress there, both in the economies, but more pertinently in the politics. The need to deal with some of the structural issues, the red lines that certain nations refuse to cross, is really, you know, hoving into view for financial markets. So I like to express a short euro sterling view. I'm a dollar bull as well, I have to say. We saw the dollar really become parabolic again during that peak of the crisis in March. That was a combination of the dollar being the world's reserve currency, being the favored flight to quality currency, and then there being this huge funding squeeze. Essentially, the entire globe is a dollar borrower and runs a short dollar position. You're talking about 10 to 15 trillion dollar mismatch between global dollar assets and global dollar liabilities. And that really does become a problem in times of stress. And so we've seen that play out through the dollar rallying very strongly across the board, particularly against emerging market nations where they tend to be dollar borrowers. We've seen the dollar come off very recently. That's largely as risk has got back into bed. All the Fed's policy actions, they've dealt with liquidity stresses very well, very robustly. But from this point going forward, it still feels to me like the risks are on the risk off side of the ledger. that should be good for the dollar. So I like both of those currencies. If I had to pick one of the two in this environment from this position, I'd certainly pick the dollar over the sort of tactical time horizon. But given we're at 123, 124, on a long-term horizon, given the range is 115 to 220, I think it is reasonable to think that the sterling can do well on that longer-term horizon. I guess implicit in that, I also talked about the Brexit situation. I'm far less concerned. And certainly in this environment where deglobalization and damage to supply chains is a global phenomenon, it might turn out to be a really good window to get through that initial stage post-Brexit, which could be disruptive otherwise. I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Michael, would you like to go next?
So if I could just second what those comments were, we also like the dollar structurally longer term coming out of this. Certainly there is a bit of the safe haven flow coming out as sentiment has improved. So I won't repeat every argument that was just made, but I think we agree with that. And what I would add to that is we certainly favor the dollar against other developed market currencies that have commodity exposure as well. So if you look at countries where commodity exports are extremely important, Australia would be an obvious one, and certainly parts of the emerging market basket are heavily exposed to commodities, and prices there are quite weak. So I would just add that as a reason to favor the dollar, at least structurally over the longer term, although I would agree dollar pound is a more difficult choice right now. Dollar euro, we certainly favor the dollar over the euro. There, I think the wild card is if you think that this moves Europe to something that looks closer to fiscal union, you could have a lot of upside in the euro, but at present we're not seeing that as a baseline case. So definitely dollars is highest in our preference for currency portfolios right now.
Great. And James McCann, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really nicely set off the views on currency and on Brexit too. So what I might do, I think, is just talk about how businesses might think about the reopening of the economy over the second half of the year and what these return plans might look like. And they're slightly different by country, but I think in general they share some common characteristics. And that's probably those really economically important sectors are more likely to come back a little bit more quickly, and those sectors in which social distancing is easier, or you can at least adapt social distancing a bit, again, is maybe more likely to come back a little more quickly. And those areas in which testing capabilities are built up, very rapidly and extensively, and are able then to prevent the reinfection rate from rising aggressively, I think that's another signpost for businesses to keep in mind. But in practical terms, we would think maybe that sectors like manufacturing and construction are sectors in which maybe you can bring people back to work under certain shift patterns with certain measures in place, that you still contain infections within your own business, that social distancing is still enforced. If we think about services, probably the environment becomes more granular. You're not looking at an environment in which we're going to be sitting in packed sports stadiums in any time soon. But if we can imagine an environment in which we're allowed in retail stores, albeit with very strict capacity constraints on how many people are out in the store at the same time, with a lot of additional costs around cleaning, around staff hours too. So I think for the services sector, it's going to be very heavily phase dependent on that. It's going to imply a higher cost pressure on the margins too. So I think it's probably the case that it's going to be very different depending on what your company looks like and how it intersects with that economic importance and that ability to implement social distancing. When we think slightly longer term, one of the ways we've been coming at this and increasingly trying to think is, what are the long-term implications when we get back past this reverse J or U or W-shaped profile for growth? What does the global economy look like? And that's, I think, where businesses maybe have some opportunity or want to mitigate risks. We will need to think that some of the structural forces which are taking place are maybe being accelerated through this process. And we can think on a few angles of that. It can be around technology. I think Liam did a really good job of talking about how working practices will be changing, how the shift maybe from online to physical retail spending might be changing. I think this is an accelerant of all those processes. We probably know that debt burdens are going to be significantly higher after this process, both from a public sector balance sheet and a private sector balance sheet. The interest rate structure, we would argue, is probably going to, again, shift lower in part to accommodate that. So I think it's about, I guess, that two-stage approach. It's thinking about how economies can successfully and gradually phase out some of these measures to bring parts of economic activity back to life. And I think that will be a very gradated process. But then it's about thinking, how does this shake up the global macro, and how does this accelerate those big forces? And what does that mean for your sector, for your business? What are the big risks that presents, and what are the opportunities? And that tends to be more of a sector by sector question, but I think there are some mega themes which will affect across those businesses.
And Liam,
Lizzy,
if you'd like to come in.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm allowed to get incredibly practical just for a second, I think one thing we've seen over the last few weeks is a strong demand from businesses to kind of audit their real estate portfolio. So I think the starting point is government advice, and governments, certainly in the UK and I guess around the world, are engaging with business to understand the practicalities of return to work. In terms of office-based businesses, I think if we think about the sort of safe space or safe distancing that the World Health Organization has kind of quoted of 2 meters between workers, the average office desk in London and in New York is around 1.5 meters apart. So you've got some changes to make there. But our teams are working with businesses running audits to actually see how can you remodel space very cheaply, so actually minimise expenditure at this stage in the cycle. And actually, in most cases, the work that's been done so far, you can reduce average occupancy by about 35%. And get yourself to sort of safe distancing standards. And I think that's probably the initial process, is just actually auditing what you've got, and then thinking very carefully who actually needs to be in the office in the short term, and then actually working from there and building over the next few months back to a more normal situation.
Lovely. Well, it's coming up to 5 p.m, so I think we'll call it there. But thanks so much to all our panel for your insights, and to everyone who is watching or submitted a question on the chat. Emmanuel, is there anything else you'd like to say before we all click off?
Or maybe before we come to close, there's one final point that we want to cover. There was a question whether the impact on trade, how long will it be? Can trade pick up between the US and the UK soon again? I think you mentioned that earlier. 20 seconds on that question. What does it look like over the next let's say, the next 18 months or so?
Which James was that to?
Let me just see. The question was directed. It's James Athey. You mentioned it earlier.
Okay, sure. So if I understand the question right, so you're waking up a bit, Emmanuel, how is US-UK trade going to be affected over the coming months? Is that the question?
So there is a question whether, because you mentioned the UK-US trade agreement earlier, whether we can expect flattening of US-UK trade over the next few months, or is there a chance for this to pick up again over the next, let's say, half a year or so?
Sure. Okay. So the biggest driver of trade between two nations is actually GDP and GDP growth, rather than any contractual relationships. The two biggest trading partners for the European Union are the US and China, with which there is essentially no trade agreements whatsoever. So the most important thing that's going to be driving a bilateral trade relationship like that is the economy. So it's fair to say, the UK and the US are similar in the sense that we are consumption-driven, service-driven, current account deficit countries. We don't produce and manufacture and export a lot. We consume and import a lot. That means we have what's called a high marginal propensity to import. So when growth goes up, we tend to import a lot more as we consume a lot more of that wealth. So it's fair to say that in a situation where directly consumers, consumption of services, but consumption more broadly are being so hugely and negatively affected, that is going to have a meaningful impact on trade during this period. Beyond the next month or two, and again, the next month or two are just going to look horrific from any angle. Q2 is almost going to be a write-off. We're going to see huge magnitude declines in GDP. I don't think we want to extrapolate that. Again, we're back to the shape of the recovery. Beyond that initial period, I do expect there to be a slowing of the pace of recovery of economies. To me, one of the big problems is that we are piling on more debt to try and deal with this situation in the short term. That debt is going to need servicing, and that likely means balance sheet repair, and that means consumers and corporates retrenching in order to try and repair the damage to their balance sheet from that temporary period. That's less pro-cyclical behavior, less spending, less investment, less hiring, and that means, you know, a slower recovery. And I think therefore the initial bounce will lead way to something a bit flatter after that. So unfortunately, I think the impact on trade therefore will be a bit more long lasting, but nowhere near the magnitude that we see over the next couple of months. Hopefully that answered the question somewhat.
Thank you very much, Lizzy. As you said, we are on the hour, so let me bring this to the close and pretty much just echo what a number of colleagues say right now in the chat, either privately or to the group, by saying thanks to the panel. This has probably been one of the most useful insights that many of our colleagues have received in a number of days. So it leaves me to say a big thanks to both James's, Liam, Michael and Lizzy for moderating that. And again, a big thanks to the team who put this all together and the over 50 businesses who joined us today. As announced earlier, a recording of the session will be available to all those who have qualified for registration. Should you also be interested in getting in touch with one of our panelists or other participants on the session, please let us know and we are happy to facilitate that. Other than that, you know where to find us. It was a pleasure to be working with all of you today, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are right now.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.